Okay, so today we're going to talk about the rise of railroads. So first we have what's called the race. So in 1863, two companies started a race to build the first railroad across the entire United States. This was called, as some of you may know, the Transcontinental Railroad, which is a railroad that stretches across the continent from coast to coast. So the company called the Union Pacific started building from Omaha, Nebraska, building west, and the Central Pacific started in Sacramento, California, and started building to the east, and eventually met in Utah, and they laid a golden spike, and it was the first railroad to actually cross the entire United States. So basically when they were building these railroads, they had a lot of trouble. They had trouble getting workers. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. After the Civil War, labor was very scarce. So you couldn't find people who wanted to work anymore because they were all working on the plantations or in the businesses in the cities in the north. So they basically hired the immigrants. They also had trouble with the land. They faced a lot of difficult terrain, such as forests, mountains, deserts. They faced a lot of weather, rainstorms, you have snow on the mountains, avalanches on the mountains, and the Native Americans, which had to vacate the land, and of course they wouldn't like that. So, this railroad gets built, but it doesn't come without its causing problems. So basically this created a giant race, the second race we're going to talk about today, to build miles of railroad. But they couldn't link these railroads together because the sides of the rails were different. These were called gauges. So the rails were bigger in the south and smaller in the north. Eventually they decide to keep the north size rails, and they were able to connect them. But basically what this led to was rate wars for all the western rail companies. So this made a high price for farmers, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But they also caused some growth. So the railroad basically became the first symbol of unity after a turbulent past known as the Civil War. New rail lines came forward that linked the east and the west, and they allowed for a quicker movement of goods and people. You saw larger population growth in the west because now people could get there quicker, and this led to new states such as Nevada, California, Oregon, Washington, and such getting formed because people can now settle there. So businesses started to consolidate so there was less competition. Larger companies bought smaller companies, or they forced them out of business. One of those famous person was a man named Vanderbilt. He was the son of a poor farmer, but he bought several small rail companies and ended up owning about 4,500 miles of track. Soon, all of the major railroads were directed by a handful of powerful men, such as Vanderbilt. As I mentioned before, this created some competition. So, this massive influx of building railroads caused overbuilding. So owners had to look for new ways to make a profit. So a lot of railroad companies were forced to offer rebates or discounts to their biggest customers. Now, railroads only would keep their big customers because for two reasons. They would be able to pay the bill, and they had no chance of going out of business. So smaller companies may not make enough money to pay their bills, and their businesses weren't exactly stable. And as we'll find out in a second, neither were the railroad companies. And so this led to companies pooling their businesses in an area and sharing the profits, so there was less competition. So what did this mean for the farmers? So basically, this competition led to rates becoming too high for the small farmer. So sometimes instead of sending their crops to market, they burned them for fuel. And a lot of farmers joined the populist movement, which called for control of rail rates. And another problem with the farming was this would cause a dramatic downsizing of businesses in the nation. So rail companies' finances were fragile. They were barely making any money without the support of the farmers. And this created a ripple effect that halted the entire economy. So what you have is, we have the rail companies' rates being too high, the farmer not paying for it, not sending his crops to market, so now the farmer is going to lose money because now he's using fuel instead of selling them. The rail company's going to lose money because they're not getting the money from the farmer. And rail companies are fragile, so they go bankrupt. But despite all of these problems, railroads created three really important things. They created a lot of jobs, such as the steelworking and lumberjacks. They had cut down the forests and use the steel for the tracks. They created new ways of managing business, so you can manage a business from further away. And they opened several new areas for settlement, which led us to several new states. And that's it.